The Amazon rainforest is the world's most efficient killing machine. 5.5 million square kilometers of green darkness where the air itself seems to rot, where a cut becomes infected within hours, where insects drink blood by the pint and jaguars drag men from their hammocks in the night. In 1925, Colonel Percy Harrison Fawcett, the most experienced jungle explorer alive, a man who had survived poisoned arrows, anaconda attacks, and diseases that had names in no European medical text, walked into this green hell with his eldest son and vanished without a trace. His final instruction, sent by runner to the last outpost of civilization, was explicit. If we do not return, do not send a rescue party. The danger is too great. Over the next 50 years, more than 100 men would die ignoring that warning. What were they looking for? What did Percy Fawcett see in the jungle that drove him to sacrifice everything, his career, his family, his life, for a city that shouldn't exist? To understand the disappearance, you must first understand the age that produced it. The 1920s were drunk on discovery. Tutankhamun's tomb had just been opened. Machu Picchu revealed to the world. The blank spaces on maps were shrinking, but they still existed, vast, tantalizing voids where cartographers wrote simply, unexplored. The Amazon was the greatest of these voids, and in London drawing rooms and New York society dinners, people spoke breathlessly of lost civilizations, of El Dorado, of ancient kingdoms swallowed by the jungle. It wasn't all fantasy. The conquistadors had written of cities in the interior, of streets paved with gold. Indigenous peoples spoke of powerful ancestors who built in stone, but the prevailing scientific wisdom of the era was absolute. The Amazon could not support civilization. The soil was too poor, the jungle too hostile. Any ancient peoples would have been primitive, scattered, insignificant. Percy Fawcett disagreed. He was 57 years old in 1925. Lean, hard, with the weathered face of a man who had spent decades under merciless suns. Born into a respectable but declining British family, he'd found his calling in the Royal Artillery, then as a surveyor for the Royal Geographical Society. Between 1906 and 1924, he'd undertaken 7 major expeditions into South America, mapping borders, charting rivers that existed on no European maps. He'd learned to travel light and fast, eschewing the massive, unwieldy expeditions favored by other explorers. While others brought piano frames and cases of champagne, Fawcett brought a compass, a machete, and an iron will. But he'd also brought back something else, a conviction that bordered on obsession. He'd seen pottery in the jungle, advanced, sophisticated ceramics that spoke of settled peoples, not nomadic tribes. He'd heard stories from indigenous groups about a great city deep in the Mato Grosso, a region of Brazil so remote that even the Portuguese had never penetrated it. And in the archives of the Brazilian National Library, he discovered manuscript 512, a document dated 1753, written by a Portuguese explorer who claimed to have found the ruins of a magnificent city. Streets paved with stone-carved monuments, temples with hieroglyphs. The explorer called it a city as large as any in Europe, abandoned and reclaimed by the forest. The manuscript was dismissed as fantasy by academics. Fawcett believed every word. He called his lost city Z. Just the letter, enigmatic, final. He spent nearly 2 decades planning to find it, but the Great War intervened, then age, then lack of funding. By 1925, the window was closing. He was approaching 60. His body, though still strong, bore the accumulated damage of tropical diseases and near starvation. If he was going to find Z, it had to be now. But this time, there was a complication. His eldest son, Jack, 21 years old and hungry for adventure, insisted on coming. Jack was everything his father was, athletic, determined, unafraid. He'd grown up on his father's stories, poring over maps of the Amazon, learning indigenous languages from phonetic guides. He wasn't going to be left behind. And Jack brought a friend, Raleigh Rimmel, also 21, eager and untested. Fawcett's wife, Nina, supported the expedition from their modest home in Devon, but others were less certain. The Royal Geographical Society offered lukewarm endorsement but no funding. Fawcett was forced to raise money through newspaper contracts and private donors. Some colleagues thought he was chasing a mirage. Others worried about the two young men. The Amazon was no place for beginners. Fawcett dismissed all concerns. He'd survived decades in the jungle. He knew how to travel, what to avoid when to turn back. This would be different from previous expeditions, smaller, faster, more secret. He wouldn't reveal his exact route or destination. Too many others were trying to steal his discovery, to beat him to Z. On February 13, 1925, the three men departed from Cuiabá, the last town on the edge of the wilderness. They carried minimal supplies: dried food, rifles, surveying equipment, mosquito netting. Nothing superfluous. Fawcett had arranged for indigenous guides to accompany them through the first stage, but he planned to dismiss them before entering the deep jungle. Too many witnesses. The Brazilian newspapers photographed them before departure. In the image, Fawcett stands ramrod straight, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the camera, beyond the jungle, toward something only he can see. Jack looks confident, almost cocky, his arm draped around Raleigh. Raleigh smiles, unaware. None of them look like men walking toward their deaths. The journey began well enough, which should have been the first warning. The Amazon doesn't grant easy passages. They traveled northeast from Cuiabá, following the course of the Xingu River through terrain that transitioned from scrubland to gallery forest. The guides were Bakari tribesmen who knew the paths, who understood which streams were safe to drink from and which harbored parasites that would turn a man's intestines to water. Fawcett spoke passable Portuguese and several indigenous languages, not fluently, but enough to negotiate, to ask questions, to avoid the fatal misunderstandings that had killed so many other explorers. Jack kept a diary, though much of it would never be recovered. In the fragments that later surfaced through intermediaries, his early entries brim with enthusiasm. "The forest is beyond anything I imagined. Father says we're making excellent time. Raleigh is holding up better than expected, though the mosquitoes are testing him." The mosquitoes always tested newcomers. They descended in clouds at dusk, a whining mass that could drive men to madness. Raleigh learned quickly to coat his exposed skin with a mixture of fat and ash, an old jungle trick, but the insects still found ways: the corners of eyes, the soft skin behind ears. By early April, they'd reached Bakari Post, a tiny settlement where the last thread of Portuguese authority frayed into nothing. Beyond this point lay the Mato Grosso proper, the thick forest. Though that name was inadequate, it was more than thick. It was absolute. A cathedral of green where sunlight arrived filtered and diseased, where the canopy towered 60 meters overhead and the forest floor existed in permanent twilight. Here, Fawcett sent back his last optimistic dispatch, carried by runners who would take weeks to reach civilization. He reported excellent progress and good health, though he mentioned that Jack had developed a minor infection on his foot. Nothing serious, already improving. He gave no indication of their exact route or final destination, only that they would be out of contact for several months while exploring a particularly promising region. Then he dismissed the Bakari guides, paid them generously, and forbade them to follow or speak of the route the expedition was taking. The three Englishmen walked into the forest alone. What happened next must be reconstructed from fragments. The final letter, indigenous accounts collected years later, and the grim mathematics of jungle survival. They were traveling light, but even minimal supplies became crushing burdens in the heat. The temperature sat at 95 degrees with humidity near saturation. Sweat provided no relief because it couldn't evaporate. Clothing rotted on their bodies. Leather boots became breeding grounds for fungi that ate flesh as readily as hide. Fawcett had solved this on previous expeditions by going barefoot, developing calluses thick as boot leather, but Jack and Raleigh couldn't adapt quickly enough. Their feet became masses of cuts and infection. The forest fought them at every step. Thorns hooked clothing and skin. Vines had to be cut constantly. The ground itself was treacherous. Solid earth could give way without warning to sucking mud or hidden streams, and the wildlife was relentless. Fire ants whose bites felt like hot needles. Botflies that laid eggs under the skin, the larvae burrowing deeper until they could be felt moving. Kangaroo fish that allegedly swam up the urethra if a man urinated in the river. Fawcett dismissed some of these stories as indigenous exaggeration, but he'd witnessed enough horror to know the Amazon wasn't exaggerating anything. They were making for a region called the Serra do Roncador, the Snoring Mountains, named for the strange sounds the wind made through the rock formations. Fawcett believed the city of Z lay somewhere in this area, based on his interpretation of manuscript 512 and his own observations of pottery distribution. He'd been planning this route for 20 years, but planning meant nothing once you entered the reality of the forest. Game was scarce. They'd brought dried rations, but not enough for an extended search. That would have required an expedition train of dozens of porters, the kind of massive undertaking Fawcett had deliberately avoided. The plan was to supplement with hunting and fishing, but the forest was perversely empty of large game. Monkeys chattered in the canopy, impossibly high and difficult to shoot. Fish in the dark rivers were wary and few. They tried to trade with indigenous groups they encountered, but the reception was mixed. Some tribes were curious, even helpful. Others watched from the forest with eyes that promised nothing good. On May 29, 1925, they reached a place Fawcett called Dead Horse Camp, though the origin of the name remains unclear. Here, an indigenous runner agreed to carry one final message to Cuiabá. The letter reached Nina Fawcett months later. She would preserve it for the rest of her life, reading and rereading the fading ink, as if it might reveal something new. The letter was characteristically terse. Fawcett reported they were at coordinates he'd calculated carefully, preparing to make the final push into unexplored territory. He wrote, "Jack is well and keen. Raleigh is struggling somewhat with the conditions but maintaining spirits. We are being watched by an indigenous group whose intentions are uncertain. I believe we are very close now. The forest here has an ancient quality. We have found pottery fragments and what appear to be old earthworks, deliberate mounds too regular to be natural. You need have no fear of failure." The final lines were matter-of-fact, almost cold. "This will be my last communication. We are crossing into country from which return may be difficult. Remember, no rescue party. The risk is unacceptable." The runner departed. The three men turned northeast toward the Serra do Roncador, and then nothing. The silence was absolute. The world waited. For months, then years, Nina Fawcett held vigil in Devon, parsing every rumor, every supposed sighting, refusing to believe her husband and son were dead. The Royal Geographical Society adopted a posture of cautious concern. Newspapers ran increasingly speculative stories, and slowly, inevitably, the silence transformed from a temporary absence into something more permanent and terrible, a void that seemed to pull at the imagination of everyone who contemplated it. How does a man like Percy Fawcett simply vanish? He wasn't some amateur wandering blindly into danger. He'd survived situations that would have killed lesser explorers 10 times over. He knew when to retreat, when to negotiate, when to fight. He understood the jungle's rhythms, its dangers, its unspoken rules. If anyone could survive the Amazon, it was Fawcett, but the Amazon doesn't negotiate. It doesn't care about experience or reputation or iron will. The first rescue attempt came in 1928, led by Commander George Dyott, a fellow explorer and acquaintance of Fawcett. Dyott organized a properly funded expedition with modern equipment, radios, medical supplies, indigenous guides who knew the Xingu region. He retraced Fawcett's route as far as Dead Horse Camp, then pushed northeast toward the Serra do Roncador, asking questions at every village, showing photographs of the missing men. Kalapalo people, who controlled the territory beyond Dead Horse Camp, told Dyott a story. They said 3 white men had passed through their village years earlier. The timeline matched Fawcett's disappearance. The men had been in poor condition, especially the 2 younger ones who were sick and weakening. The Kalapalo had offered food and shelter, but Fawcett had refused to stay, insisting they push on. The chief had warned him that hostile tribes controlled the territory ahead, tribes who killed outsiders without question. Fawcett thanked him and continued anyway. 5 days later, the Kalapalo said they saw smoke signals from the east, the kind of smoke that announced a killing. Dyott questioned the chief extensively. The old man seemed genuine, even sorrowful. He said his people had liked the elder white man who treated them with respect, but that the younger men had been weak, struggling. The forest was eating them, the chief said through a translator. He claimed his warriors had gone to investigate the smoke and found the white men's camp destroyed. their possessions scattered but no bodies. The evidence suggested an attack by the Suya or another hostile group. Dayat wanted to push further to search the area where the smoke had been seen, but his guides refused. That territory was suicide, they insisted. The tribes there would kill the entire expedition. Dayat, facing mutiny and limited supplies, was forced to turn back. He returned to civilization with the Kalapalo testimony and concluded, reluctantly, that Fawcett and his companions had been killed by hostile indigenous people. Nina Fawcett rejected the conclusion absolutely. Her husband was too experienced, too careful. If the Kalapalo story was true, and she wasn't convinced it was, then there must be more to it. Perhaps Percy had been captured rather than killed. Perhaps he'd been adopted into a tribe and was living somewhere in the interior, unable or unwilling to return. Her conviction inspired others. Throughout the 1930s and 1940, a steady stream of explorers, adventurers, journalists, and mystics mounted expeditions to find Fawcett or discover his fate. Most turned back after encountering the same walls of indigenous resistance and impossible terrain. Some simply vanished, adding their names to the growing list of men swallowed by the search for the searcher. In 1932, a Swiss trapper named Stefan Ratten claimed he'd found Fawcett living as a captive or guest of an indigenous tribe. Ratten returned to civilization with stories of a white-haired old man who matched Fawcett's description, living in a village deep in the Mato Grosso. He organized a rescue expedition, returned to the jungle, and was never seen again. In 1951, Orlando Villas-Boas, a Brazilian explorer who'd spent decades living with indigenous peoples, investigated a new lead. The Kalapalo told him a different version of their earlier story, or perhaps a more complete one. They admitted that Fawcett's party had indeed stayed in their village, and that Jack and Raleigh had been severely ill. Fawcett, desperate and possibly delusional from fever, had insulted the chief during a dispute over food. The young warriors, enraged, had wanted to kill all three men immediately. The chief had forbidden it, but after the expedition left, the warriors had followed and killed them away from the village, dumping the bodies in the river. Villas-Boas believed this account. It explained the lack of remains. The river, full of piranhas and caiman, would have disposed of bodies within hours. It explained the smoke signals. It even explained the Kalapalo's earlier evasions. They'd been protecting themselves from accusations of murder. But even this version had problems. Why would experienced warriors leave scattered possessions? Why hadn't they kept the valuable metal tools and rifles? And if Fawcett had been killed in 1925, who was the white-haired old man that multiple sources reported seeing in the 1930s? Other theories proliferated. Some claimed Fawcett had gone native deliberately, that he'd found his city, or something like it, and chosen to stay, abandoning civilization entirely. This theory appealed to romantics but ignored everything known about Fawcett's character. He was devoted to Nina, obsessed with proving his theory to the scientific establishment. He wouldn't simply disappear by choice. More darkly, some suggested the expedition had descended into madness and violence, that starvation and disease had broken them, that they'd turned on each other in the green twilight of the forest floor. The mystery deepened with each investigation, each new testimony, each contradiction. It was as if the jungle itself was lying, offering different stories to different searchers, keeping its secrets through misdirection and multiplication of possibilities. By 1960, over 100 men had died searching for Fawcett or trying to solve the mystery of his disappearance. The number was imprecise, because some expeditions vanished so completely that even the casualty count was uncertain. The Amazon had transformed Percy Fawcett from a man into a myth, and myths are harder to kill than men. But what if Fawcett had been right all along? What if, beneath the mythology and tragedy, there was something real waiting to be discovered? For decades, the academic establishment maintained its position. Large-scale civilization in the Amazon was impossible. The soil was too poor, the environment too hostile. Any indigenous populations would have been small, scattered, primitive. The jungle was a counterfeit paradise. As one influential anthropologist called it, lush on the surface but fundamentally unable to support complex society. This certainty began to crack in the 1970 and 1980 as satellite imagery and aerial surveys revealed something extraordinary beneath the forest canopy: geometric patterns. Miles of them. Earthworks on a scale that couldn't be natural, perfectly straight lines, circles, squares, networks of what appeared to be roads or canals stretching across hundreds of square kilometers. The patterns were invisible from ground level, hidden by centuries of forest growth. But from above, using infrared photography that could penetrate vegetation, they emerged like the bones of something massive showing through green flesh. In 2003, American archaeologist Michael Heckenberger began excavating sites in the upper Xingu region, not far from where Fawcett had vanished. What he found rewrote the history of the Amazon: the remains of a settlement called Kuhikugu, a planned community that had housed thousands of people, possibly tens of thousands. There were plazas, defensive earthworks, roads connecting multiple settlements, evidence of intensive agriculture and fish farming. The settlement dated back at least 1,000 years and had survived until the arrival of Europeans and the diseases they brought. Kuhikugu wasn't primitive. It was sophisticated, organized, deliberately engineered, and it wasn't alone. As researchers began examining the geometric patterns visible from aerial surveys, they realized they were looking at the remnants of a network: dozens, perhaps hundreds of interconnected settlements stretching across the Amazon basin. The soil problem that academics had cited for decades, solved through terra preta, black earth, a human-engineered soil created by mixing charcoal, bone, and organic waste that remained fertile for centuries. The indigenous peoples of the Amazon hadn't simply adapted to the jungle. They transformed it, cultivated it, built within it on a scale that rivaled anything in Mesoamerica or the Andes. Population estimates were revised upward dramatically. Where scholars had once assumed the pre-Columbian Amazon held perhaps 1 million people, new evidence suggested 8 million, possibly more. The forest that Fawcett had walked through in 1925 wasn't pristine wilderness. It was a graveyard, an empire in ruins, overgrown and depopulated by European diseases that had swept through generations before any explorer ever arrived. The irony was crushing. Fawcett had been dismissed as a fantasist, chasing fairy tales. But his core intuition, that the Amazon had once supported major civilization, was correct. He'd simply been looking in a world that had already ended, walking through ruins so thoroughly reclaimed that they were invisible. Whether his specific city of Z existed, whether manuscript 512 described a real place or a fever dream, these questions remained unanswered. But the principle was vindicated. The Amazon had secrets. The jungle did swallow cities. In 1998, Brazilian journalist Misha Williams claimed to have found bones belonging to Fawcett's party. She'd been investigating in Kalapalo territory and was shown a burial site by indigenous guides who said it contained the remains of Englishmen from long ago. The bones were excavated and sent for analysis. DNA testing proved inconclusive. The samples were too degraded, but the morphology suggested European ancestry, and the age was approximately correct. Nina Fawcett, who died in 1954 still believing her husband was alive somewhere in the jungle, wasn't there to learn that her vigil might finally be over. Her surviving son, Brian, examined the evidence and rejected it. The bones were too short to be his father, he insisted. Percy had been tall, lean, distinctive. These bones belonged to someone else, one of the 100 other men who died searching, perhaps. The Kalapalo themselves offered yet another version of events in the 1990. An elderly tribesman, speaking to researchers, said his grandfather had told him the true story. Fawcett and his companions had died of natural causes, fever and starvation, while camped near Kalapalo territory. The tribe had buried them in the river according to custom, then denied knowledge because they feared being blamed by white authorities. This version aligned with both the earlier testimony and the later bone discovery, but it still left questions. Why had the stories changed so many times? What details were being protected or obscured? Perhaps the most haunting theory came from anthropologists who'd spent years living with Amazonian tribes. They suggested that the truth might be culturally untranslatable, that indigenous concepts of death, time, and presence didn't map neatly onto European questions about what happened to specific individuals. When the Kalapalo said they'd seen Fawcett's spirit in the forest, or that he'd become part of the land, they might not have been speaking metaphorically. The insistent Western demand for a single, factual narrative might be asking the wrong kind of question. But there was one more piece of evidence, discovered in 2004, when researchers gained access to previously sealed files in the Royal Geographical Society archives. A letter, written by Fawcett in 1923, 2 years before his final expedition. In it, he confessed to a colleague that he'd been having dreams about the jungle, vivid, overwhelming visions of a city in the forest. He wrote, "I cannot explain it rationally, but I feel called to this place, not as an explorer but as someone who belongs there. Nina thinks I'm becoming obsessed, and perhaps I am, but I've come to believe that finding Z isn't about discovery, it's about return." The letter suggested something darker than simple obsession. It suggested a man who'd already begun to leave civilization behind in his mind, who was walking into the Amazon not to conquer it or map it, but to surrender to it. What do you do with a mystery like that? The Amazon doesn't give back what it takes. This is the first lesson and the last lesson, learned by every person who's walked into that green cathedral hoping to return unchanged. In 2005, 80 years after Fawcett's disappearance, journalist David Gran retraced the expedition's route as closely as modern research would allow. He traveled with indigenous guides, carried GPS equipment and satellite phones, had evacuation plans and emergency supplies. Even with every advantage of 21st century technology, the journey nearly killed him. He contracted a fever that left him delirious. He was bitten by insects that left wounds that wouldn't heal. He learned what Fawcett had known intimately. The Amazon is patient, and it always wins. But Gran also witnessed something Fawcett never lived to see, the validation of his vision. He visited Cuhicugu and saw the earthworks, the evidence of roads and canals, the remnants of a civilization that had numbered in the thousands. He spoke with archaeologists who were still discovering new sites every year, each one expanding the understanding of what the pre-Columbian Amazon had been. The counterfeit paradise was revealing itself to be something far more complex, not virgin wilderness, but a managed landscape, a garden on a continental scale. Fawcett had been wrong about many things. His city of Z, as he'd imagined it, stone temples and hieroglyphs, a New World Rome, almost certainly never existed. Manuscript 512 was likely a fabrication or a fever dream. The pottery he'd found was real but didn't point to a single lost metropolis. His methods were sound, but his conclusions were too specific, too influenced by European expectations of what civilization should look like. But he'd been right about the essential truth. The Amazon had stories to tell that science wasn't ready to hear. There had been cities. There had been engineering and agriculture and complex societies. They'd simply been built differently, thought differently, existed differently than the stone monuments of Egypt or the Inca. They'd been made of earth and wood and understanding, materials the jungle could reclaim in a generation once the people who maintained them were gone. The diseases came first. Smallpox, measles, influenza, plagues that swept ahead of the conquistadors themselves, carried by indigenous traders and escaped slaves, jumping from village to village with devastating efficiency. Populations collapsed by 90% or more. The survivors scattered, simplified, forgot. By the time explorers like Fawcett arrived, they were walking through a post-apocalyptic landscape, a civilization's ghost, and they couldn't recognize it because the jungle had already begun its work of erasure. What killed Fawcett and his companions? The most likely answer is the most mundane. They starved. They fell ill. They weakened past the point where experience and willpower could sustain them. Perhaps they were attacked by indigenous people protecting their territory. The Kalapalo testimony suggests this, though the details remain contradictory. Perhaps they simply collapsed and the jungle consumed them, as it had consumed thousands before and would consume thousands after. Or perhaps, And this is where history dissolves into something more uncertain. Fawcett found something that changed him. Not a city, but a perspective. A way of seeing the forest that made return to civilization impossible. His final letter hinted at this transformation. The forest here has an ancient quality. Not ancient ruins, ancient quality. As if the jungle itself was the monument, the living archive of everything that had been lost. There's a photograph, unverified and possibly fraudulent, that surfaced in the 1940. It shows an elderly white man among indigenous people, his hair long and white, his face weathered beyond recognition. Some claimed it was Fawcett. Others dismissed it as misidentification or deliberate hoax. The photo was analyzed, debated, and ultimately filed away as inconclusive, but it captured something true regardless of its authenticity. The fantasy that a man could walk away from everything he'd been and become something else entirely. That the jungle offered not just death but transformation. Nina Fawcett died believing her husband was alive. She spent 29 years waiting, defending his reputation, rejecting every piece of evidence that suggested he was gone. Her faith was either heartbreaking or admirable or both, a refusal to accept that the jungle could be that final, that absolute. When she died in 1954, her last words were reportedly, "Percy will return." He never did. No one does, not really. The people who go into the Amazon come back changed if they come back at all. The forest leaves marks that don't fade, in dreams, in the sudden panic at the sound of insects, in the understanding that civilization is thinner than we pretend, a temporary agreement that can be revoked without warning. Today, the Xingu Indigenous Park protects part of the territory where Fawcett vanished. Indigenous peoples who survived the catastrophe of contact live there, maintaining what they can of their ancestors' knowledge. The earthworks are mapped, but largely unexcavated. Archaeology is expensive, the sites are remote, and there's a growing understanding that not everything needs to be dug up and cataloged. Some secrets can remain secrets. The question isn't really what happened to Percy Fawcett. The evidence, assembled from fragments and contradictions, suggests he died somewhere in the Mato Grosso in 1925, along with his son and Raleigh Rimal. Their bodies were likely consumed by the forest, buried in rivers, scattered by animals, reclaimed by the soil they'd walked upon. The real question is why we needed him to be lost. Why the mystery had to remain unsolved for so long. Why 100 men felt compelled to follow him into the green hell, knowing the odds, knowing the cost. Perhaps because Fawcett represented something we've lost and can't quite articulate. A time when the world still had blank spaces, when discovery was still possible, when a man could walk into the unknown and genuinely not know what he'd find. The Amazon took that away. Not by killing Fawcett, but by keeping him, by transforming his disappearance into myth. The jungle is still there, 5.5 million square kilometers of it, still keeping its secrets, still patient, still waiting, still winning. It doesn't care that we've mapped it from satellites, or that we've found Kuhakugu, or that we've understood, finally, what Fawcett intuited but couldn't prove. The green hell remains. And somewhere in it, in soil or river or the rings of ancient trees, are the remains of 3 men who learned what the forest teaches everyone eventually, that we are temporary and the jungle is forever.